Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Spare a Thought, the podcast for curious minds exploring creativity, culture, and stories from the margins. I'm your host, Tom Spare. I've been away for a little bit. I was away in Copenhagen, went to see Olivia Dean live, and took in some of the landmarks, food and culture, which I'll be sharing in a later episode. Today, I'm talking to writer and creative facilitator Taylor Edmonds to explore the therapeutic power, the words, and the inspiration behind her creative company, Writing for Joy. You'll recognize Taylor's voice from a couple of episodes ago, the editor of The Waters That Raised Us, which I've linked to in the show notes. Here's Taylor Edmonds and Writing for Joy.
Hi, my name is Taylor Edmonds. I'm a writer and creative facilitator from Barry in South Wales. I'm also the founder of Writing for Joy, which is my sort of creative company where I provide writing for wellbeing workshops for adults and young people, and I run a monthly journal club through that as well. So I'm really passionate about kind of improving the accessibility of creativity and giving communities more access to how creativity can have a massive impact on well-being.
Amazing. Well, thank you for being a guest today. The first question is about how you became a writer or became interested in writing. What lit the spark for you, and was there a moment where you thought, yes, this is what I want to do? Because often that can be a bit of a challenge, that some people take an interest, but actually taking it further is another thing entirely.
Yeah, I suppose for me, it always started as being a reader. I was such a massive reader from as long as I can remember, and I would just devour book after book after book. And then I suppose I just got to a certain age and just thought, how do you write? Became quite interested in things from the other side. And luckily in school there was, we were encouraged to write poems and write stories, and it very much started through my education. And then I was such a Tumblr girl when I was a teenager. It was all about Tumblr, and I started sharing some of my poems there. So I guess I always had some sort of instinct to share what I was writing. They still exist on the internet somewhere. I hope nobody ever finds them because they're quite awful, but they're also just part of your process of becoming a better writer. You have to write you have to start somewhere, don't you? Then I suppose that moment for me was when I decided to study creative writing. I remember being torn between creative writing and photography. So it's definitely going to be something creative. I just didn't know which path to take. And luckily I chose writing, and I went to uni. I did a undergrad and a master's in creative writing. I feel very lucky that I did that, because that gave me the tools to kind of consider myself a writer, to learn a little bit about the industry, but also just gave me really valuable time to dedicate myself to building a creative practice and finding my path in creativity and what interested me the most. So it really started with that, and I suppose because I was dedicating years of my life and getting into a lot of debt for it, it was okay, I've got to run full force with this now. Just always been a way for me to express myself, to comment on the world around me and my experiences, and to connect with others through shared experiences as well.
Where did you study? Where was your BA?
I did my undergraduate in the University of Gloucestershire in Cheltenham, and then my master's was in Cardiff Uni.
Okay. So a couple of questions there around, because you grew up in Barry. What was it like going over to study in England? Did you feel more Welsh when you moved over to England?
Yeah, I suppose I'd never really thought about I don't know, I feel like in Barry, you are Welsh, but you don't feel like Welsh, which as I've got older, I realise is just really stupid. And obviously, yes, you are Welsh, but I didn't grow up speaking Welsh or have a particularly Welsh accent, as if there can't be lots of different kinds of Welsh accents. But yeah, and then when I went to England, I suppose I realised people thought I sounded Welsh. People, were like, oh, you're from where Gavin and Stacey is filmed. And like, you do kind of realize that the way that people are in Wales is different to England. And like, there's a lot of just random phrases, like even realizing that we say, scram, like when someone like scratches you, and they don't say that. And I was like, really? There were so many little tiny things like that I realized were like Welsh quirks. But I suppose it did make me aware of like being Welsh for probably one of the first times.
Yeah. And I think things like tooth and
and cool, like the way that we talk is obviously different.
And then my other part of that question is obviously you'd been writing on Tumblr. It's interesting you say you haven't returned to that work, because last year when I went to visit, I grew up in Dover in the southeast of England, so I grew up by a lot of water and by the sea. I have an affinity to places with the sea, although I'm not a very confident swimmer, so I'm always an observer of the sea rather than a sort of participant in it. But I found a notebook dated as well, which is very rare. I don't date much of it's quite inconsistent, and it's from when I was like 16. And I don't have any diaries or anything, so that's my only like little insight into that window of that 16-year-old. And I haven't looked through it all. Every so often I have a bit of bravery and I flick through some of the pages. So I feel like I'm communing a bit with my 16-year-old self.
Takes you back.
But I can't really remember being 16, which is quite weird. My brain's just been protecting me a bit.
Blocked it out.
Blocked out all the embarrassment, so I can appreciate that it's difficult to return to old work. But given that you built that interest and you were doing Tumblr and took an interest, was it difficult to then transition from an interest in it to then study? Was that difficult?
Yeah, it was. I suppose I just did it for the love of it, and then you kind of study it, and it does take a little bit of that love out, because it's it's institutionalized in academia, so it becomes like this really serious thing, and there's all these rules, and these are the canon of writers who are like amazing and you should imitate them, but what if I don't like them? It was definitely an experience having what was a hobby like institutionalized, but nevertheless I think it was like a really good experience for growth and to learn about craft, and to like, even if I don't take all of that advice as like fact now, I know that rules in creative stuff are made to be broken. I think it's still good to have like an awareness of those things, and I do feel like it's a privilege to study a creative subject. So yeah, I'm really glad that I did choose to study it. I don't think that you have to study creative writing academically to be a writer at all. But for me, it was just valuable time, and just to learn as much as I possibly could to find my own voice within that somewhere.
Yeah, and I think probably evaluating what makes a good piece of work as well, and what's an effective way of getting a message across. I definitely found, because there was a 10-year gap between doing my undergraduate and doing my master's, and I was a far better student when I went back.
Yeah.
And I sort of compared myself to like a bit of a grizzled old football player who's sort of like maybe not as quick as the others, but as a bit more smarter with how I use my energy. And I had a bit more life experience behind me. And I was like 10 years older than most of my classmates as well. So I took more of an interest because it cost me more, in the sense of, I had a promising career, and if I'd stayed at the university, I probably would eventually end up in a decently paid job and all that sort of stuff. But it wasn't talking to me in the same way, and my passion and everything.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's great to hear that you thought, well, I like this, but I also want to understand the nuts and bolts and what makes it work.
Knowledge is I like to learn things, and then you can kind of do with that what you want, isn't it? I think find your own voice and your own way of writing in between all of the kind of conventions and the expectations, your voice is somewhere in the middle of all of that, and that's kind of like the journey of studying, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Yeah. And just sort of finally on the what shaped you as a writer, did you find, I guess it sort of links to my other question of going from Wales to then living in England. Did you start to realise that Wales had an impact on your writing? Was it coming out in your writing more about talking about Wales and living in Wales?
More so later, more so
Okay.
when I returned, and really that's been through nature. Finding a sense of like who I am as a Welsh person, like where my Welsh identity feels the most tied to. That's definitely the natural world. Growing up by the sea, being in an hour's drive from Benai and the mountains, and kind of like, yeah, that's where I found my writing has led to, in a really natural kind of sense, to have an interest in the natural world in Wales, but also for me just to feel like more connected to my heritage and the land that I come from as well.
Yeah. So it's sort of a fundamental part of who you are, and so it shapes that. Mention that in the piece as well, around 20s being choppy, and then hoping that your 30s would maybe produce something a bit more solid. And
20s are for finding yourself, right? So they're the messy years, they're the stumbling over, making bad choices, learning lessons, but then towards the end, like starting to really know who you are, have a sense of confidence and security, so that you go into your 30s kind of with a solid foundation. That's the purpose of the 20s for me anyway.
I wish someone had told me that, because I arrived in my late 20s when the lockdowns came, and so I sort of always felt like there was a bit of theft going on there, a bit of daylight robbery. But also then it made me think, oh, actually I don't want to live this sort of life. I want to do something else. And I suppose from there, the motives behind writing, Orwell talks about four motives for writing. So egoism, aesthetic, enthusiasm, historical impulse, and political purpose. Do any of those resonate at all with why you write, or is it something different, do you think?
I suppose maybe it's a little bit of all of those things in some way. I've not really considered the why so much. I don't really know if it can be defined into such specific separate things like that. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with Orwell on that, but there is a multitude of reasons, and kind of like I said, there was that kind of just impulse to express myself, the impulse to connect with others through creativity, because I think when you hear or you read something that you relate to and you feel seen by it, there's some really lovely connection that happens between writer and reader there. And just I kind of see myself as a bit of an observer who's just noticing things, listening, paying attention, and translating it into some weird shape or form or whatever kind of comes out. I just love telling stories, and I've always been one of those people that's away with the fairies. People have always described me in that way. But writing is such a great teacher of paying attention, of being present and noticing things, because even the most ordinary situations are just can make brilliant stories, and often they're the ones that I find the most interesting, that I relate to the most, is rooted in the ordinary and the everyday, and just uncovering the magic that lies there. I really enjoy that process.
I mean, Bryony talks about this in her classes, actually, about finding the sort of the detail, that's something tangible that you can link, even if you're in a big fantasy world. Having something that roots your reader in, to go, there's this specific detail, or there's the look in someone's eye, or the way in which they held something, and or the way I I don't know, a piece of a rock is shaped by the water or something like that. It brings in the reader, doesn't it? It invites them in.
Yeah, and you have to be paying attention to notice those things in that like intimacy and that much detail, right? So
Mm.
if you're just kind of zooming through life and you're never taking the time to pause and pay attention, like all of these amazing things can just pass you by.
Thinking about the work that you do and the book that you've edited as well, from Orwell's List, there's notable absence of joy or writing for well-being. Obviously,
Yeah.
he was a very different generation, and a different experience. And he was coming through when very tumultuous times, so he's probably shaped by that. So where does writing for joy and well-being fit into the work that you do?
It's just become the center of my work, really, in a very like natural way that I maybe wasn't expecting. Kind of just thought I'd be a writer and never a teacher. And then I just like happened upon teaching and just discovered this like great love for being a teacher. So I tend to focus my writing workshops around kind of writing for well-being, because as I said, I feel like it's just what I've got from writing in my life, and then I've kind of gone to study it and I've kind of got the tools under my belt. And a lot of people feel like they're not a writer, or they look at a blank page and it's too intimidating, or they can't find the time to have like a regular writing practice, like all of those kind of barriers that are there for people. And through my workshops, I like to just show people that even if you're just giving me this hour, like you can spend this hour being present, being reflective, and using your creativity to help you feel lighter, if only for an hour. So I work with a lot of people who are like marginalized in society for various reasons, or people that are in hospital, suffering from illness, any kind of thing like that. I think you can bring writing as like a really simple tool to like lift someone's day even just a little bit, and that's just given me the greatest purpose in my work as well.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of like different experiences, I suppose, of people that are writing. Some people, like the groups I go to, that hour is the only time that they have in a really busy week. They might have kids, or they might work nights, and also with the examples you've given about ill health and obviously if you're struck down with ill health, your world is very internalized, so you're probably living more with your thoughts than the average folk who can get out and find an escape somewhere else.
Yeah, and I found that I work in Velindre Cancer Centre, and run courses there for people living with cancer, and I found that for those people, they want to use that time as like a bit of escapism, like to just have an hour where they're going to come and use their creative brain and leave everything at the door just for a moment. Of course it's still there, of course it comes up in the writing and the discussions, but they just want to sit and write, and there's something like really peaceful about the room where everyone's kind of just scribbling away, and then they share like really personal things, like just about themselves, not necessarily about cancer, but you get to know each other in such a like intimate way in a writing workshop. Like you would never learn these things about people if you just had a conversation on the street or something. And I think there's really special something in being able to like facilitate that space for other people that I really enjoy.
And people that are faced with those challenges and might have a very limited time left, probably offers a type of clarity in writing that others might not have. That must be quite difficult to navigate, though, in terms of your energy levels and what you're absorbing emotionally as well. Is it challenging from that sense?
Of course it's taxing work, and the reason that I do it is because I care deeply. So obviously you do give yourself a lot, but I've just established like good routines and like self-care habits for myself, just in knowing that if I'm not looking after myself and filling up my cup, I can't, how can I expect myself to, give to other people? So, I'll always, and it can be very simple things. It's like every time before a session, I take a walk around the park and just breathe deeply and turn up with a clear head. I'll journal before and after, and I work with the psychology team there. So there's always a psychologist like in the room with me, and then we have a debrief after. So like there's always someone there to like share the experience with. So yeah, it can be challenging sometimes, but it's just very purposeful work for me. I really enjoy it, and if I can give someone a break in the middle of like a really tough time, then I'm very happy to do so.
Yeah, and I think I always seek out jobs, but then I've ended up in roles where I want to see the impact of what I do, because that's like important to me personally. So that must be very rewarding to see someone's day sort of lifted a bit, or a burden that's taken away, even for a brief time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's very rewarding.
As you sort of mentioned and alluded to, your work spans poetry, facilitation, editing, playwriting, which we'll talk about in a bit. Of those, where do you feel most comfortable? And also then, which one of those do you feel like you sort of have to maybe up your contribution a bit to get there?
I suppose poetry was my first, like that's how I first started writing. That was my main focus when I first started. So I'd say that's probably my comfort zone. And then playwriting is what I've come into most recently. So my first play, Demand the Impossible, was on last year, that I worked on with Commonwealth Theatre. And that was my first stage play. So that definitely, like, I learned a lot. It's a whole new form, and it's a form where you have to release a bit of the control in comparison to the others, because there's a director, there's a dramaturg, there's actors, there's in the case of Demand the Impossible, there was like AI technology, there was musicians. So you have your vision, but then you also hand it over to others, and you have to trust their vision as well, and how it will all come together with all the different sort of elements. Luckily, I had an amazing team, and it was nothing but like a great process to see how the words like took on new life and were embodied by the actors. But yeah, that was something very different for me. So yeah, it was hard work, challenging work, but it was also like an amazing process that, yeah, I grew a lot from it as well.
Yeah. I mean, because I went to see Demand the Impossible, and I know Bianca, who was performing in there, and I've known her for a long time.
She's brilliant.
Yeah, she's absolutely incredible. And I saw in another production, I can't remember, it very relatively early on into the pandemic, and it was all about a funeral procession. And
oh yeah, that was Circle of Fists. Gavin, forgotten his name. Gavin Porter, is it?
Okay, yeah. I don't know. This is the thing. Because so her sister Sinead said, "Oh, do you want to come to this production that Bianca's in?" And I always say yes to these things, because I'm like, it might change my life, and that production did. And going to see Demand the Impossible also changed my life and my insight.
That's great. I saw Circle of Fists as well, and it was incredible.
Yeah, so because that was all about personal experience of people that had lost people, and so and it was like the audience joins in the funeral procession, and then I was like, Demand the Impossible was so involving. Do you want to talk about we'll talk a bit about how it came about, but the subject matter of Demand the Impossible?
Sure. So Demand the Impossible essentially told the story of people who were part of left-wing activist groups that were infiltrated by undercover police. And this was, it's commonly known as like the spy cop scandal. This happened from actually even in the 70s, the very early moments of it, into the noughties. And it was where like a branch of the police was basically set up to infiltrate left-wing activist groups. So people that were environmental campaigners, people that were anti-racist campaigners, even came down to a big scandal of blacklisting with construction workers and electricians, where construction companies were blacklisting workers that were like politically involved in kind of protests or organizing or unionizing. Completely illegal, of course, but they would be informed by the police. So yeah, this whole massive, disgusting kind of thing that was happening. And then we created the show to kind of, based on actual interviews with activists that were directly affected. And like you mentioned, Bianca in the show, her character was very much based on her own personal story. So she was when she founded Black Lives Matter in Cardiff in the, that kind of revival in 2020 after George Floyd was murdered, but based on a life of kind of like being treated awfully by the police. So she was based on herself. There's another character that was played by an actor called Sol, and he was based on a blacklisted construction worker. So that was somebody called Steve Barley, who we spoke to, who basically, because of his activism, suddenly found that he had no work, and he didn't know why, and he kept getting rejected for jobs, or he kept getting fired, and he basically just couldn't find work. And that was happening to a lot of the people in his circles that were also politically active. And then the other character, who was played by Hasina Raja, was an environmental campaigner. So there was lots of people who, were campaigning, like anti-war campaigners who would do demonstrations in arms factories, who, were saving trees from being cut down, like all of that kind of breadth of what it means to be an environmental campaigner. And a lot of women were kind of deceived into intimate sexual relations with the undercover police. Some of them, for years of their life were in a relationship with someone who wasn't what they thought they were, who wasn't who they thought they were. And it was thanks to the efforts of these women who kind of brought this whole scandal to light through basically taking on their own detective work and eventually finding each other. The public inquiry about all of this is still ongoing to this day. So it's very much, even though it happened, it's very much a continually present kind of issue that's ongoing as well.
And just the final reflections, really. You founded, as you mentioned, Writing for Joy, and much of your facilitation work is built around writing as a tool for well-being. In an age of AI, where AI can generate text instantly, what does it mean to find joy in the things that you write?
I think that I don't feel like the experience of producing your own work, of like using your brain and like turning a blank page into something, can be replaced with AI. From like my experience of writing, sure, it can like write a whole book in like less than a second or whatever, but it doesn't, I don't think yet anyway, it has that ability to reproduce the magic of like actual human creativity. And then also in the workshop experience, sharing that physical space with people, or even if it's like an online workshop, I don't think AI can replace that human connection. And I think in the era of it, we are just longing for that more and more and more. It's here, and it's not, you can't ignore its presence and how it's changing the world. But I do think that the more that we move towards that AI kind of way of like being online and of producing things, people do long for that like slower, more human connection. And that's really what I'm interested in.
Yeah. And I think it aligns also with the wider conversation we're having about like social media, for example, because that was always planted in our heads as something that connects people.
Yeah.
But actually now it demonstrates in various lawsuits that it's very much not.
Yeah.
It's been designed to make us hate ourselves and hate other people.
Yeah.
So I feel a healthy skepticism towards AI. I do use it in my work and in putting the podcast together. When you're solo like me, producing and everything, you do need a bit of assistance, but it's never in the driving seat. And I think that's the really important thing.
Yeah, I agree. And I just think, focusing on those kind of real human connection elements, and, producing, if I use AI to write a poem, it's not going to give me the same benefits and feeling that I have from like kind of sitting down and solving that problem myself and
Mm.
using my creative brain. It doesn't give me that same experience. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm most interested in.
Yeah, 100%. And I did read somewhere where they said trying to solve difficult problems, part of the thing is the journey getting there.
Yeah, it's the
You know,
process. Yeah.
it's the process. Yeah.
Not
Even for
always about the
scientists.
outcome.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but even for like scientists who
Mm.
obviously they want their work to be sped up a bit because they don't want to. Yeah, some people might spend an entire lifetime trying to solve a problem.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily about even getting to the destination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose we need to remind ourselves of that it's not always about the outcome, like to enjoy the process as well.
Yeah, that's everything for me. I don't know if you had any final thoughts at all.
No, just thanks for having me. It's been lovely to chat to you and yeah, talk about these things. So thank you.
A big thank you to Taylor for taking part in this episode. To find out more about Taylor and her work, head to tayloredmonds.co.uk. You can follow this podcast on Instagram at Sparrowthought Media and on Substack on tomspare.substack.com. The title track for this show is Young Shall Grow. Credit and thanks to Afro Cluster, Magugu, and Asha Jane. Sparrowthought is a Be The Change Media Network production. Thanks for listening.
Whether you like them or not, young shall grow. Better fill them with love. Them to know in this life you don't